So the first approach, how to verify whether the trade-off conceptual framework really holds for some real companies in real life. We already described it. It was related to the regression analysis and understanding of the main determinants of the financial leverage, and then interpreting the signs of the coefficients in front of the determinants. I already illustrated it in a previous piece of our class. That is the second empirical approach to understand the existence of trade-off logic in actual business in some particular companies, and it's based on the panel regression analysis. Remember that the trade-off insists that you will always try to find that balance between benefits and costs. And you need your target capital structure, and you need, therefore, your target level of debt capital in your company. If you look now at that equation which describes the logic of the particular analysis, you will see on the left side the change in the amount of debt of some company I at some year T. If you now look to the right side of the equation, you will see in brackets the difference between the target amount of debt of a company I at that particular year T and the previous level of the debt of the company in the year T minus 1. We also have the beta, which is the coefficient of adjustment to the target level of the capital structure and the target amount of debt, which is here represented with the D and star. So if we now summarize all these variables and how they should be related and think about this, the equation says the changes, actual changes in the amount of debt of different companies year by year should be related to the deviations of their previous level of debt or amount of debt from their target level of debt, which should be set up for particular year. And the beta, this is the sensitivity coefficient or speed of adjustment, which is related to the trade-off theory or trade-off adjustment coefficient. So to be successful in verifying or proving that the trade-off logical financing really exists for some particular sample within some period of time, through time, running that panel regression analysis, the researcher should get at the end of the whole exercise the beta very close to +1. So if you are lucky, you will get it, then you will finally say, wow, all the changes in the amount of debt are at a high level could be explained by the changes, deviations of previous level of debt from the target amount of debt. What is going to happen if you didn't get beta very close to +1 and the beta is really very small? So you cannot then say for sure that all the firms in that sample really follow that logic of financing. But you may assume that there are some companies in that sample that follow that logic, as well as there are some companies which are not keen on that logic, on that understanding. They do not have that particular motivation for their capital structure choice. In our research lab, which is the lab in corporate finance, which I established in our university in 2006, At the early years of our work in the lab, what we were doing, we were trying to understand whether those corporate finance conception really hold for the Russian companies. So for that period of time, we also made that approach, and we applied that panel regression analysis. So what lessons we can derive from those studies? If you divide your subsample then by some criteria, let's say by the type of the ownership, or let's say by the size of your company, it may happen that when you again run your panel regression, but separately for each subsample, you may have finally the very interesting result that in some situations, some subsamples will really provide you with beta very close to +1. On opposite, another subsample in that regression divided by the same criteria will not follow that logic. So it says that starting with this overall regression, then according to the first step results, how far or how close is the speed of adjustment beta coefficient to +1, the researcher may subdivide the samples and try to understand in more details which subtypes of the firms in the sample are much closer to that mode of thinking. How we can understand and measure the target level of debt and the target capital structure, because everything is related in that particular exercise to the deviations from the target level of capital structure. And there are two classes or two types of methods that we can indicate here in that slide. The first is so-called simplified approach, because in some situations the researchers will just will pick up the mean financial leverage for the sample they build for that particular period. In some other situations, the researchers will adjust that mean financial leverage to the risk level. On opposite, some other papers are built on the so-called fitted value, which means that the researcher himself or herself should build the financial model and try to model the future level of the target debt inside the capital structure according to different assumptions and different scenarios. That approach is illustrated here in that slide, saying you need at first go through the step number 1 we already described and find the determinants. Why? Because then using those determinants and applying specific scenarios, you can forecast the future target level of financial leverage by specific types of regression analysis. Finally, you as a researcher should also think about the speed of adjustment and the drivers or variables that can explain the speed of adjustment. And due to the speed of adjustment, as we already discussed when we were discussing the principles of the trade-off theory, the variables behind the speed of adjustments can explain the range of the deviation from the target level of capital structure. So then the researchers also may even make their modeling more complicated, trying to introduce different patterns of adjustments and then trying to look what's going to happen. So this is more time-consuming approach. Of course, it requires more data. It requires building some scenarios. It requires building some relationship inside each scenario, because it needs to explain the target level and the speed of adjustment and the drivers behind the target level of capital structure and the drivers behind the speed of adjustment. So that's why we cannot meet it in every paper devoted to the tests of trade-off theory, but this is really powerful approach despite it's really time consuming. When the researchers are trying to understand what is behind the adjustments to the target level of capital structure, in many papers we can extract from those papers really very interesting lessons. Remember that at the beginning of the class I also mentioned that Stu Myers, who was originally writing about that conception of trade-off theory of capital structure, he threw into the discussion the question whether the target varies itself. So we building the panel regression through time within several years of our period of analysis and observation. We have to follow the results of previous research, which shows that if your company is in a growing market, in a growing industry, or if your company is in an industry with a very fast technological changes, then it may lead to the conclusion that the target capital structure itself will change rather often. If your company is not in those types of industries, you at first may say it's time invariant target. So he's not going to change fast, to change quickly due to the pressures from the industry type or technology changes speed. So in that situations, you need be very carefully looking on the type of the managerial team inside those companies, because some research also shows there could be some correlation between the target changes and the changes in managerial teams. If there is a high management turnover, which says that the executives are leaving company really often, and new executives, new top managers come to the company also often, then when the management team is changing, especially on the top levels, then the research shows that the target level of debt in the company will change just at time when the team is changing. And maybe the whole motivation for the long-term financing policy also changes at time of the changes in the personal combination of executives and top management team. What else can influence the adjustments to the target when modeling, when trying to find this fitted value approach to the level of debt in the capital structure of the company, target debt of in the capital structure of the company? Researchers also show that the transaction costs may matter in terms of the difference between the costs when the securities new issues are released to the markets, let's say new corporate bonds or new equity issues, and this is the remedy to change the debt to equity coefficient. When the new issues are coming to the market, the transaction costs will be different than when you are repaying your debt, you are repurchasing your corporate bonds. In some cases it's possible, or if you are repurchasing your equity shares. So you see now how complicated could be modeling of target level of debt, but it's worth doing for the researcher because it's really more smarter approach to understand the different drivers behind capital structure decision, and then to find really more accurate answer whether the trade-off theory holds. Finally, there is very important point, so-called debt conservatism. Remember, if we are talking about the trade-off conception, we should be very cautious about the cost of financial distress. And there is some academic discussion in the research papers saying that if you look carefully, you may find the situations when companies are really under-levered and they are surprisingly conservative in using the debt. And in many cases, it concerns the large and profitable companies which have, as we already mentioned, somehow lower or relatively lower cost of financial distress. And this is like a contradiction to the trade-off theory, because trade-off theory says if you have high sensitivity to the cost of financial distress, and if you are going to have really higher cost of financial distress, then your debt, target level of debt should be lower. But we also showed that the size and the profitability have statistically significant positive relationship with the leverage coefficient in empirical research of the first type, which looks for the determinants of the leverage in the samples under study. So Graham wrote a paper showing this is surprisingly conservative approach. How it could be explained? There is no explanation for this under-levered level of capital structure. Say it in other words, companies are very conservative. It could be in many cases, when companies that may have much higher financial leverage don't make that particular decision. They will not increase their financial leverage. In some other papers of the researchers, the additional efforts were applied to adjust the level of the leverage to the risk. And those researchers written here in that slide, one of those papers is showed here, they said that the benefits of debt may be even magnified by the risk level of the company. So if you adjust to the risk your raw data that you use in your research empirical approach, then it should offset this conservatism towards the debt. So this is still under debate, but those debates in academia, they show the situation is not very simplistic, the situation is not very evident. And the research, of course, continues. It's ongoing problem, because the time is changing, the business model are also changing, the national economies are changing, the industry trends are changing. So, and that's why the academicians who work in the university, as we are doing in our university, in the High School of Economics in Moscow, we also need to continue this type of the research.